Hello, everyone. Welcome to the July RDLA monthly webinar. I'll give everyone just a few seconds to log on this morning, this afternoon, depending on your time zone, and then we'll jump right to it. All right, wonderful. Well, welcome to the July RDLA monthly webinar. I am Shannon Von Felden. I'm the Senior Director of Advocacy here at the Every Life Foundation and lead the Rare Disease Legislative Advocates Program. If you prefer to call into today's webinar, you are more than free to do so. If you have any questions for any of our speakers or staff, please feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A box or the chat. We'll be keeping our eye on those boxes. And then we'll pose any questions to the speakers directly to them after their presentation. And we do have closed captioning available on that black bar at the bottom of your screen. You can hit the closed captioning button in order to view the closed captioning. And Lauren is going to insert the link for the English to Spanish translations into the chat for anyone who would like to use those. So we are in July, which is halfway through the year, which means we're a quarter of the way through the congressional term. And many of our members will be headed back to the districts in August, and many of you will be participating in meetings this August during Rare Across America. So this is a great time to be catching up and learning about some important access issues that are impacting the rare disease community and hot topics in Congress right now. We're joined by 5 speakers who will be touching on 4 different issues today for us. We're going to start with Emily Carroll and Heather McComas with the American Medical Association, and they're going to talk about prior authorization issues. Then Molly Ford with the National Society of Genetic Counselors will be discussing a piece of legislation a lot of folks in our community are aware of, the Access to Genetic Counselor Services Act, and looking forward to hearing where that's at. And then third is Sarah Sultan with the Haystack Project, and she's going to talk about the Protect Rare Act. And then Lindsay Greenleaf with ADV Health is going to finish us out today, talking about a really timely, if you've been watching any commercials on TV lately, pharmacy benefit managers reform. So really looking forward to learning more about all 4 of these topics. Thank you to all of our speakers today. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Emily and Heather.
Great, thank you so much. I am Heather McComas from the American Medical Association. Really great to be here with you today. I know that I can speak for Emily as well on this, but we talked to a lot of different groups about prior authorization reform, and I think we take a special interest and attention when we talk to patient-oriented organizations, because at the end of the day, prior authorization, while it certainly is an issue about physician burdens and is concerning to our members because of that, it ultimately is a patient issue. It's a patient harm issue. And so we really enjoy interacting with patient organizations on this topic. Go ahead to the next slide, please. And so one of the things we've really tried to drill down in on our advocacy in recent years is the patient impact of prior authorization, because I think at the end of the day, and certainly Emily can talk about this more when she's talking about state legislation on this topic and building coalitions, we feel that to get reform accomplished, we really need to show the patient impact of these health insurance requirements. The AMA has been conducting an annual survey of about 1,000 practicing physicians over the past 7 years, and consistently, year after year, physicians are reporting that this process delays patient care and actually hurts patient outcomes. The overwhelming majority of physicians in our 2022 survey, 94%, indicated that prior authorization can lead to care delays. And then there are downstream consequences of these delays. It leads to patients abandoning their treatment. It negatively impacts clinical outcomes. And most concerningly, 33% or a third of physicians indicated that prior authorization has led to a serious adverse event for a patient in their care. These are things like hospitalization, permanent impairment or injury, or even death. So that's, I think, really a heart-stopping statistic for all of us to consider. And although it's not on this slide too, that these serious adverse events are obviously very costly for our healthcare system. We also asked physicians if, about the impact on overall healthcare costs, and 86% indicated that prior authorization can actually increase overall healthcare costs, which is kind of nutty because we all know that's the opposite of the intent of the health plans. They're trying to reduce care spend. So we're not even really sure if this process is accomplishing the savings that it's supposed to, or it's purported to by health plans. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So I guess that's the bad news. Patients are being hurt, and our physicians are being taken away from interacting with patients to deal with paperwork. The good news is, I think, as I'm sure we're going to be talking about a lot today, we've seen a lot of interest in this issue the past years, and it's gotten federal attention, which is really great. Something important that happened earlier this year was that CMS finalized their 2024 Medicare Advantage rule, and there were some important provisions in there related to prior authorization reform. The first thing this rule accomplishes was going after the clinical criteria that Medicare Advantage plans can use in their prior authorization programs. And this was in part spurred by a OIG, Office of Inspector General report that was released in 2022, which showed that patients who have Medicare Advantage sometimes aren't able to access the same care that they would be able to get if they were Medicare fee-for-service patients. So that's obviously not supposed to happen, and led to the release of these new requirements on MA plans, which will go into effect beginning of 2024. So the relief from this rule is coming soon. The rule says that the Medicare Advantage plans have to offer the same services to patients that they would be able to get under fee-for-service Medicare. They have to follow national coverage determinations and local coverage determinations when they're available. And if not, they have to use well-established clinical guidelines that are publicly available. In other words, they can't just be making up new clinical criteria and putting in a black box. It has to be accessible. And then the plans also are required to establish a utilization management committee that will be reporting to CMS and showing that the plans are following these new requirements, and that the plans also cannot deny care based on provider type or setting, which we know is really important sometimes, particularly for post-acute care discharges. Plans are limited what kind of setting that a patient can be discharged to. The rule also had some really important new protections for continuity of care. We all know that when patients switch between health insurance plans, it can really lead to disruptions in ongoing successful treatment. The rule says that the plans must provide a 90-day transition period during which the new plan cannot require a new prior authorization for ongoing care. That's really important. Also, and this is another important angle on that continuity of care protection, the prior authorization approval duration must extend to the whole course of treatment. In other words, the MA plans can't have repetitive requirements. And we know this is a really ongoing problem. We hear all the time from both physicians and patients that their plan is requiring prior authorization every month or every couple of months for a course of treatment they've been on for years. And also it says that MA plans cannot retroactively deny coverage. We hear about this all the time. It's very alarming. So that's something that's really important for both physicians and for the patients. And finally, the rule, it doesn't go as far to require MA plans to offer gold carding programs that would exempt physicians with strong track records of prior auth approvals from prior auth requirements, but it is encouraging plans to offer these kinds of programs, which is really important because it would reduce the overall volume of prior authorization requirements facing physicians and patients. We go to the next slide, please. So there is another CMS prior authorization rule out there, and this one has not been finalized yet. So that's important a distinction to make here. This one is dealing a little bit more with the technology angle of the process. And it's also a little different in that it expands the scope of plans that would be impacted. It includes Medicare Advantage, which is really great. There was a previous iteration of this proposed rule that came out at the end of 2020, and it didn't include Medicare Advantage. So the AMA and a lot of other stakeholders encouraged CMS to add Medicare Advantage to this rule's provisions. And CMS did that in this iteration, which is great to see. It also applies to Medicaid, Medicaid managed care plans, CHIP managed care plans, and qualified health plans under the federally facilitated exchanges. So as I mentioned before, a lot of the rules provisions relate to technology. The plans that are affected by this rule would have to offer an electronic prior authorization process that integrates with physicians' electronic health record systems and kind of handle the whole process from soup to nuts through the EHR. It would tell the physician when the physician starts to order a service, hey, your plan, this patient's plan requires prior authorization. It would uncover the documentation requirements for that service, and then it would allow the physician to send the necessary information to the plan via their EHR. So this does have the potential to make the process a lot more quick and make it far more transparent than it is today, which is really great. And it also should enable the process to be quicker. So the rule is proposing some new processing timelines for the impacted plans. It is proposing that urgent prior authorizations be completed in 72 hours and that regular prior authorizations be completed within 7 days. The AMA appreciates this proposal directionally, but we think those timelines, I think we can all agree, are much too long. If you have an urgent health condition, you shouldn't have to wait 72 hours. So we advocate for prior authorizations being completed within 24 hours for urgent care and 48 hours for regular non-urgent cases. Another important requirement that would be accomplished by this rule would be public reporting of prior authorization program metrics on things like approval and denial rates, overturns upon appeal, and average processing time. We think this is a really great thing to hold plans accountable for ensuring that patients are getting the care that they should be getting under these plans. But we did encourage CMS to require more granularity on the data to show specific kinds of services, not just overall at the plan level approval and denial rates. We also encourage the government to put these transparency requirements into place faster because we think it will be important to see the impact of the electronic prior authorization programs that will go into effect in January 2026 if this rule goes forward. And so we'd have kind of a baseline to measure against if we had a transparency. And then also would require plans to indicate the specific reason for a denial, regardless of the processing method of the prior authorization. So even if it was being done manually, the plan would have to give a specific reason for denying the prior authorization. You can go to the next slide, please. And this rule we are very excited about, in part because it mirrors a lot of the provisions in a piece of federal legislation, the Improving Seniors Timely Access to Care Act that was active in the last session of Congress, that included a lot of the same provisions, things regarding the electronic prior authorization requirements, the public reporting of statistics. And so there was a lot of commonality between that CMS proposed rule and what was in this piece of legislation. It had overwhelming bipartisan support, which I think is really amazing in today's political climate. It passed on a voice vote in the House last September. Unfortunately, the Congressional Budget Office gave it a pretty high score, and so it didn't get through the Senate. And right now there isn't an active version of the legislation in Congress, but everyone's kind of watching to see what happens with the CMS rule. And it's possible that new legislation could be introduced after the rulemaking is complete to fill in any holes and to codify the provisions of the rule and get the same things accomplished. And go to the next slide. I think I'm going to pass it to Emily for the state ledge part. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Heather. And thanks for inviting us to be part of this webinar. I am just going to quickly kind of talk about some of the action that's been happening in state legislatures, because I think one, there has been up until recently, most of the action around prior authorization has been happening in the states. And two, a lot of the state action, as Heather has mentioned, has informed sort of the federal action. So really important to know what's been going on. For the past several years, the AMA has been working really hard with our partners in the state legislatures and our state medical associations to push for prior authorization reform. A lot of this kind of same principles that Heather mentioned that we've seen in the federal rules and in the federal legislation have made their way into state laws over the last several years, including some of those quick response times. As Heather mentioned, we really urge the 24 hours for urgent care and 48 hours for non-urgent, but we've seen a varying degree of response times in the state legislatures over the years. Another issue that we really press for, and I think is really important for both patients and physicians, is that the person making the determination whether a drug or service is approved is a peer of the treating physician. So the same physician licensed in the same specialty and practicing in that state. I think this is really important to make sure there's not unnecessary delays and to ensure that we're not kind of relying on the appeal process to make these determinations, which results in even more delays for the patient. As Heather mentioned, we've seen this in the federal rules, but a lot of states have enacted prohibitions on retroactive coverage denials if care is pre-authorized. And this, again, is really important for patients and physicians who could receive approval to go ahead with a service, but then be stuck with the bill later on when it's ultimately denied. Another issue that has been really present in state legislatures over the last couple of years, and I think this is a critical one, is that we're not repeating prior authorizations for patients with chronic conditions. So your condition has remained the same, your treatment has remained the same or may vary dosage-wise or other things, but you're not repeatedly going back to the physician's office or other healthcare provider in order to get that prior authorization month after month. Just an incredible waste of time, often results in delays and loss of function and other healthcare status that could be avoided if you didn't have to repeat that prior authorization. Heather also mentioned this proposal, but this is in a lot of states, state laws right now, that there is continuity care when a patient switches plans. I think this is particularly relevant as we're looking at the end of the continuous coverage requirement for Medicaid, and we're seeing a lot of patients transfer off of Medicaid and onto commercial coverage in the next coming months, and making sure that care isn't disrupted as those transitions happen. And then I want to talk about gold carding specifically, because I know this was of interest to a lot of folks on this call. And gold carding, as Heather mentioned, is the kind of this concept that if the physician has a good track record, has a high approval rate for a specific drug or service, that they kind of get a green light, a pass to get that prior authorization, from getting that prior authorization. So we've seen a lot of states consider how to do that concept. And I think it's really, the AMA fully supports that because of the goal, which is a volume reduction effort. I think all of our advocates in the states and all of our members are feeling an increased pressure around prior authorization, that the volume is just ever increasing and there's no relief. And it's on things, it's not a targeted process anymore. It used to be for high cost drugs or services, and now it's on generics, right? It's on low cost items and services that it doesn't quite make sense. So this idea of volume reduction, potentially through the use of this gold card, is a really attractive idea, I think, to a lot of physicians and patients. So we've seen a couple states be able to enact legislation around this. Some of them are very specific. We've seen sort of Texas model, which really lays out exactly how the gold carding works, how many services you have to complete in order to get the gold carding, when it can get pulled, those sorts of things. Texas, Arkansas has a similar law. We've also seen a couple of states that have enacted more vague laws that kind of let the insurer develop the gold carding program itself. So We're kind of still watching to see how some of these proposals play out. We're excited about them, but we know it's kind of a potentially complicated process. So we are supportive and optimistic that they will prove to be good efforts. But we also don't consider gold carding in and of itself as the answer to prior authorization reform. You can see on this slide are the number of other proposals that we advocate for in the states and at the federal level. And we think all of these proposals are equally important sort of in getting to both improving the process and reducing that volume and ensuring access to timely care. So very excited about gold carding. Don't think it's the single answer, and we would continue to support the concept of gold carding in broader prior authorization reform. So I'll kind of leave it there, but I will say there were I think about 30 plus states this year that had prior authorization reform proposals introduced. We've seen about 7 or 8 enacted so far, and we're really working hard to make sure more than that are enacted this year, and laying the groundwork for the next legislative session as well. So I will pass it back to Heather to just really quickly talk about our grassroots work.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, Emily. So the last thing we just wanted to quickly mention is we do have a grassroots prior authorization website, fixpriorauth.org. It has tracks geared at physicians and patients and even employers. We think employers are good advocacy target as well. We have associated social media campaigns, and we have a method to collect patient and physician and other healthcare professional stories on prior authorization. We really encourage you to leverage that and submit patient stories on the website. They're really, really, really helpful in our advocacy. And also, someone was asking about the Improving Seniors Timely Access to Care Act, and our Fixed Prior Auth social media networks definitely are very active in kind of getting people to contact their members of Congress to support legislation. And also there was a recent Dear Colleague letter that members of Congress sent to CMS to urge them to finalize the rule that I was talking about earlier. So very much encourage you to check it out. And it has all of our AMA prior auth resources on it, including the survey. I saw that someone asked about that too. So that is available on the website too. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you so much to Heather and Emily. We really appreciate you being here today, and all the useful information that you guys provided. And I know that Heather was in answering questions, and I think we're in good shape there. So thank you. I would like to go ahead and pass it on to Molly Ford with the National Society of Genetic Counselors to talk more about the Access to Genetic Counselor Services Act.
Great, thank you so much. You can proceed to the next slide. Okay. Yeah, so I'm here to provide an overview of the Access to Genetic Counselor Services Act. We have a bill that's been introduced in the House and the Senate. It is S2323 and then HR 3876. So this bill would essentially authorize the Medicare program to recognize genetic counselors as Medicare providers. Right now, Medicare covers the service of genetic counseling, just that because genetic counselors aren't yet recognized, genetic counselors can't provide that service without supervision, without billing incident 2. So this is something that would allow genetic counselors to see Medicare beneficiaries without supervision to directly reimburse. And then we have that reimbursement set at 85% of the physician fee schedule. It's an access issue. This would enable Medicare beneficiaries to see directly genetic counselors without worrying about having to be scheduled under the supervision constraints. It allows for telehealth, and it's certainly is something that we're working toward and have for the last few years. It is also a cost issue. Genetic counselors, this is what they do. It's their bread and butter. They're up to speed on the latest genetic tests. They take very thorough family histories so they can, they know which test to order, the appropriate person, appropriate test, appropriate time. And so that can sometimes lead to a site-specific test rather than ordering an entire panel, which is a cost savings of thousands of dollars at times. Next slide, please. So some of the access issues we're seeing is that, again, you have to, Medicare beneficiaries have to jump through several loopholes, several hoops to actually see a genetic counselor. Genetic counselors are licensed, and their practice acts enable them to practice independently in states. So again, this is just an artificial barrier, and it's just due solely to the fact that they aren't yet Medicare recognized providers. And so what happens though is that the physician referral process is inhibited at times because a genetic counselor has to have an established working relationship with a physician to see those physician's patients. So if a physician does not have that working relationship with a physician, with a genetic counselor, that individual has to refer a patient to another physician to be established to see that physician's genetic counselor. And so that that first physician runs the risk of not seeing that beneficiary return to because that person's already gone to another physician to be established. So it's an extra couple of steps there for Medicare beneficiaries. It's definitely not necessary, and it's something that kind of hurts that access issue. So the bill itself, the current regulation requires that supervising physicians bill on behalf of those genetic counselors via Incident 2. This bill would remove that so that genetic counselors can bill directly, as they do with third-party payers and with every other non-Medicare beneficiary. Next slide, please. Okay, so a quick update on HR 3876. It was introduced early last month, and we have our bill champions of Adrian Smith from Nebraska and Brian Higgins from New York. And we were able to launch this bill with the 13 original co-sponsors, a very nice balance of Republicans and Democrats. And then right now we have a 19 total co-sponsors. And so we have a good representation from Energy and Commerce and Ways and Means. Those that are bolded here are Ways and Means. And then in asterisks, we have, or I'm sorry, in italics, we have Energy and Commerce. And then those who are in asterisks are our original co-sponsors. Next slide. And then our Senate bill was introduced just last week. Senators John Barrasso and John Tester introduced. And then Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee also was an original co-sponsor. She's also on finance with Senator Barrasso, so good representation already there. The inaugural bill had secured 7 co-sponsors. We introduced that last Congress. We intend, and we're doing active outreach with those 7. We're hoping that we kind of launch this year's effort kind of where we stopped last year. Next slide, please. Yeah, so activities lately have been following up with co-sponsors from the previous Congress with both the House and Senate, get those numbers up pretty quickly. We're conducting a lot of virtual congressional meetings with genetic counselors. So NSGC, the National Society of Genetic Counselors, works very closely with its members to get them in front of their members of Congress to talk about this bill. And so that's one good thing of COVID is that virtual meetings have become commonplace on the Hill. And so we're able to put constituents in front of their representatives much easier without traveling to Washington quite so much. And so that constituent voice, that genetic counselor voice has really been heard a lot more already this year. We have a coalition that we're adding to, and right now we have about 450 organizations. Those organizations actively support this bill, have endorsed it, and some of their lobbying teams are also helping with this bill. When we do strategic outreach to our coalition partners, many of our rare disease friends are on that list too. So we're very grateful for those relationships. And then just 2 days ago, we co-hosted the Congressional Rare Disease Reception with the EveryLife Foundation, and that included PMC and Alexion as well. And so we were able to host that and had a really good turnout, and we were able to hear from genetic counselors, some patient advocates and patients, et cetera. So it was really great to be a part of that. And then we continue to get the word out on this bill through you all, and obviously through our networks, both with the coalition and our genetic counselor members. Next slide, please. And you can just hit that one more time. Okay, so just some past updates on just the activities that we've been doing. We really launched this effort in 2018 just as a feeler bill. We came right back in 2019 and launched this bill again. A little bit of a disruption from COVID, but we came back and really put the genetic counselors in front of their members of Congress through those virtual calls. And so between 2021 and 2022, last 2 years in the 117th Congress, we were able to hold almost 300 constituent meetings with members of Congress or their office representation, and secured 69 co-sponsors in the House and 7 in the Senate. So we really are going to build upon that number for this year. That 69 representation was very good. We had 46% of that representation were on the committees of jurisdiction. So it was either Ways and Means or Energy and Commerce. And then the 54% were just general, very balanced Republican, Democrat, bipartisan support. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we have a coalition that is growing almost daily. And so if you're interested in that list, it's actually on the NSGC's website under federal policy. You can kind of see who has signed on to that bill. And in just 2022, we had 200 organizations signing on. We right now have over 450. We have 65% of ASCO state chapters. We've had representation on rare disease legislation, legislative day on the Hill. We have given presentations to NCCN. We've engaged hospitals, and all of which are reflective in that list. And then our year-end letter campaign last year in our hopes of getting onto a vehicle at the end of the year, generated outreach from many members on that coalition and resulted in 254 organizations' signatures on a letter we sent to members of Congress. Next slide, please. So our next steps is continuing to do what we're doing. We're recruiting co-sponsors for both the House and Senate bill. We are obviously looking at those committees of jurisdiction, Ways and Means, Energy and Commerce, Senate Finance. And then NSGC has a committee called the Advocacy Coordinating Committee. Those are genetic counselors. They are volunteers. It's to help kind of that peer-to-peer outreach. So genetic counselors are reaching out to genetic counselors, raising awareness of this bill and getting them to help out with grassroots, as well as those constituent virtual meetings that we have with John Richardson, who oversees our government relations efforts here for NSGC. And then we work very closely with Capitol Council. It's a lobbying firm in DC as well. Both John and Capitol Council hold a lot of in-person meetings with committee staff, some leadership, et cetera. So those strategic meetings are being held kind of on the higher level, and that's kind of what those two do. Again, and then we anticipate our goal is to get a congressional hearing on this bill so that we do get some action, some traction here, especially as we start thinking already toward the end of the year and what year-end vehicles are coming up. Next slide, please. Yes, so I'm happy to take some questions. I think I see a few in the chat.
Yeah, I think
very much.
one especially pertinent, Molly, is a question in the Q&A about whether there are similar issues that genetic counselors face in the Medicaid program, and if there are there any activities taking place to solve those issues?
Yeah, so it's not nearly as an issue with Medicaid. And of course, Medicaid is state-based, and you're seeing, obviously what we're seeing with third-party payers too is that you always look to the Medicare example, but that access issue is not happening with the Medicaid population. It is specifically with Medicare.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for answering that. And I know that this is a bill that many of our advocates have advocated for in the past. And as you may know, Rare Across America is coming up. So if any advocates wanted to ask their members to support this bill, are there materials that they can find on your website, or
Yes,
perhaps materials you can share with us?
Yeah, and right after I'm done speaking, I can drop that into the chat, that link to where those materials are.
Perfect. Wonderful. Thanks so much, Molly.
Of course.
All right. Well, that was very helpful, and we'll just keep chugging along. Next, we have Sarah Sultan with the Haystack Project to talk about the Protect Rare Act. Sarah, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're great.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'll try and talk a little fast and make up a little time for folks. So I want to mention that while I'm talking today about the Protect Rare Act, and thank you so much for inviting Haystack Project to talk about that. I just want to mention that we've been doing a ton of work on IRA and 340B and Medicaid, and have added 2 new board members that some of you may know, Victoria Blatter and Lynn Taylor. And so there's information on what we've been doing and our new board members on the website if you guys are interested to learn more about them. Next slide, please. Great. So to jump right in and talk about what exactly is the Protect Rare Act, by way of a little bit of background, the legislation addresses something called medical necessity. And so just to give you a little context, what is medical necessity and why should this audience in particular care about it? These are just two really simple words that wreak havoc on rare disease patients being able to have insurance companies pay for to cover the treatments that they need, that their doctors say they need. And so essentially, if your treatments are deemed, quote, medically necessary by your health plan, by Medicare, Medicaid, it can be also ACA and private plans, then it'll be covered by insurance. So what does it mean when an insurance company looks at a treatment option that your doctor says you need and decides whether they want to pay for it or not? They basically look at the definition of medical necessity, which is that the treatment that the doctor wants you to have is on the label of the drug, meaning that FDA, when it approved the drug, put on the label the very use that your doctor says you need it for, or the use of the drug is in a compendia, which is essentially a book of drugs and their uses that might not be on the label, but are in this book. So the problem really comes down to rare disease treatments, the ones our doctors want us to have, are rarely labeled or indicated for the use that the rare patient needs it for. So it may be that the drug is indicated or was approved by the FDA for use in a much more common condition, or in one rare disease, but not in yours, or maybe even a subtype of a disease, for example. And there really are no compendia for rare diseases. So if the insurance company wants to deny oftentimes a very expensive drug, almost always the case in rare diseases, they are easily able to rely on this definition, the current legal definition of medical necessity, and deny access to the patient. Next slide, please. The result is obvious. The claim is denied. You get a nice the patients get a letter saying, sorry, this is not medically necessary. Patients are left wondering what that means, since the doctor decided what was medically necessary for them, presumably. They also get a very nice little thing at the bottom that not so helpfully says, if you want to appeal, here's where you can appeal the decision. What they don't tell you is that the appeal will go back to the definition of medical necessity, and you'll be caught up in this loop, if you will. So Emily and Heather talked earlier about taking time away from patient care. So the same thing happens here. Before you can get to a decision about prior authorization, in fact, the bill that AMA folks talked about, the threshold question is it medically necessary? And only after you get through that gate can you get to the luxury, if you will, of fighting about prior authorization. So it's kind of nice that these two bills are being talked about together, because both of these things are incredibly necessary and incredibly time consuming, both for the patients and for the doctors who are trying to treat really rare diseases. So I like to say that in Medicare, it's almost easier because it's an outright denial and they're just going to keep on denying you. Medicaid is a little bit harder for patients and for doctors because it's more of a policy. They don't have to deny you, but they certainly make you run the gauntlet, with doctors and patients having to spend hours and hours and hours trying to justify why this is medically necessary for patients. And by the way, if they get through and a patient in Medicaid actually gets the treatment and the insurance company, Medicaid, pays for it, and the next day another patient just like that patient comes along, same state, same managed care plan in Medicaid, same disease, same subtype, same everything, same doctor even, and asks for the same drug, the answer isn't, oh yeah, we saw one of these patients just the other day, we know all about this, yes, of course we'll pay for it. No, the answer is, we'll make you go through the same rigmarole all over again and may well deny you or may give it to you. But you got to start all over again. Okay, next slide, please. So that brings us to the reason why the Protect Rare Act exists. This is the new name. Oops, sorry, back up for one quick second. I tried to make this logo big enough so that you could read what the protect part stands for. It's really important, the language of why the bill is named this way, because it's the opportunity for equal and comparable treatment. And we'll talk about that because essentially we're not asking for special treatment under this bill for rare diseases. We're literally asking for the same thing that other people with more common conditions have. Because remember, a common condition, if you have hypertension, diabetes, almost always those drugs are labeled or indicated for that use. And so the health insurance plan, Medicare, Medicaid, look at the treatment the doctor wants you to have. They say, oh yes, this drug is indicated or labeled for hypertension. Sure, you can have it, we'll cover it, no problem. Those patients pay the same premiums and deductibles as we do in the rare community. And yet, unless we want the hypertension drug too, we're paying for something that we aren't really getting. So equal and comparable insurance is really critical. And that's what this bill is about, equal footing. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the Protect Rare Act, this is not a new problem. It turns out that years ago, cancer patients were dealing with the same thing. And you can see why. Often cancer treatments are given in combination with other drugs, or they're given for only first-line treatment or metastatic treatment. And if a doctor decided that he needed or wanted to give it earlier, wanted to give it in combination with something else, immediately it would be off-label. And back then, insurance companies only had to look at the label in order to deny access. So great news, Congress solved this problem for cancer many years ago. So we have a precedent. Basically, Congress said back then that for cancer, medical necessity would be not just on label, but now in compendia, in the books we talked about before, or in 2 peer-reviewed journal articles. This revolutionized cancer care, continues to revolutionize cancer care today. In fact, today, the reason almost all health plans look at on-label and in compendia, as we said at the beginning, is because of this law Congress passed. But because it is limited to cancer, it doesn't help those of us living with rare conditions that are not cancer related. So we started a long process of doing a lot of homework, talking to clinicians, treating physicians, leading compendia out there. The preeminent compendia out there in cancer is NCCN. We talked to the head of NCCN, Robert Carlson, who explained to us that 3% of all the cancers that are off-label don't even make it into his compendia. And he said, we work really hard. And if you ask us what the 3% are, it's the rare cancers. So we ourselves struggle with the rare cancers. So broadly, all rare diseases that don't even have cancer in common, they're never going to have a compendia, as he taught us. So the current definition just doesn't work for us. 95% of rare diseases don't have a treatment for them, so there's no labeled in drugs, and we're never going to have a compendia. So what do? Well, we propose a solution that actually we discussed with Dr. Carlson. What comes before a compendia listing? Actually, it's clinical guidelines. And those then make it into the quote book, if you will. I'm oversimplifying a little bit. So we said, okay, if compendia can grow up and become sophisticated after Congress passed this law for cancer, certainly we can look at clinical guidelines out there for rare diseases now, and more of them could proliferate if this law were to come to pass. So we proposed a solution that once again expanded the definition of medical necessity, this time for rare diseases. So it would say, the Protect Rare Act would say, for Medicare and Medicaid, that medical necessity means that the insurance company looks not just at the label, not just at compendia, but for rare diseases looks at clinical guidelines or 2 peer-reviewed journal articles, and then decides if something is medically necessary that the doctor has prescribed. Okay, next slide, please. So that is essentially the Protect Rare Act. It is jointly referred to Energy and Commerce and Ways and Means in the House, 2 different committees. So we worked very hard to get two Republican and a Democrat from Ways and Means, and a Republican and a Democrat from Energy and Commerce. That has happened. These are our lead sponsors in the House, Congresswoman Matsui and Dunn from Energy and Commerce, and Kelly and Thompson from Ways and Means. The bill is going to be introduced very shortly, or it'll be wait till September, because we don't introduce bills during recess. And so the legislation is coming back from Ledge Council now. And if we don't manage to get it done next week, if Matsui and Dunn don't manage to get it introduced next week, then we'll look for the bill in September to be introduced. But in the meantime, Matsui and Dunn have said they'll circulate bill text so that people at Rare Across America, or people just wanting to deploy their organizations and their patients to help, can certainly send that bill text around and ask their own senators and congressmen to support the legislation. So what can you do to help? As I said, you can ask your own congressmen and congresswomen, your own representatives, if they would like to join the 4 leaders on the bill. And if you'd like some help for knowing how to do that, please reach out to Haystack at haystackproject.org, and someone will help you as much as they can. And we'll talk about ways in which we're helping in just another slide or two. Next slide, please. And in the Senate, the bill would be referred to the Senate Finance Committee. We have 2 Senate Finance members ready to introduce this bill as well. We've worked very hard on that all this year. Again, it's 1 Democrat, 1 Republican on the committee itself. We are waiting on CMS to provide us some feedback to the committee staff so we can get the bill introduced. In this case, what can you do to help on the Senate side? You can certainly ask your senator to contact the committee staff to inquire about the progress on the PROTECT Act. That's not to say that committee staff isn't trying to be helpful. They have pinged CMS repeatedly for us to try to prioritize the issue. But the more they hear from senators that this bill is of interest to them, hopefully the more we can speed this process along. And again, if you'd want to know more about how to do that, don't know the exact verbiage to use or what have you, please contact Haystack at this email address and someone will respond quickly. Next slide, please. So when you contact Haystack Project, what can you expect? There is already a sign-on letter for your group. If you'd like to sign on and thank the sponsors in the House, then your organization will be added to their press release when they make the introduction. And one of the slides here in a minute gives you the text of that letter. I'm not sure if these slides are being shared with all the attendees, but in case it is, I've put the text in there. You could also ask, and they can also provide you a 1-pager that explains the bill, so you can share that with your patients, but also with the senators and congressmen, so they know exactly which bill you're talking about. And then they also can provide you a short script, if you will, that lets you share with your patients or even in your own organization that you can use when you're calling the Hill, emailing them, tweeting them. You know, if you would like a little script for how to do that and then modify it yourselves, they'll also provide you that. And they can also add you to a distribution list to get more information so we can let you know when the bill gets introduced and, you know, for future milestones. And finally, there's a monthly call of anyone and anyone who'd like to participate to discuss the progress and in terms of ideas for advancing the bill. How could they help more, or what could they do, or what should we be doing differently to keep the bill moving? And so that monthly brainstorm and execution sort of happens, and we can add you to that as well. Next slide, please. This is the sign-on letter. I won't take time to review it now. I'll just say it's in your slides, and you can ask Haystack Project at that email address to send you a copy of it. We are collecting signatures now, so if you can share it, you know, with your own organizations, but also with others you belong to, that would be great. We are gathering signatures as fast as we can. Next slide, please. Here are some links to our website that will allow you to find a copy of the last year's support letter, the 1-pager yourself, so on and so forth. So the bill text itself. So here are some links if you want to search it out yourselves. If you don't want to reach out to Haystack Project, you can find some links yourself. Next slide, please. And I kind of jokingly wrote operator standing by, but I really do mean it, that Haystack Project really prides itself on responding to every patient and patient group we hear from as quickly as we can. So I don't want to say lightly that, you know, this, because it's not a specific name of a person, that you're going to be going into some, you know, black box and you'll never hear from us. You really will hear from us. My email address is also on the bottom of this slide, but either one is, you know, feel free to use, but we really are standing by to see if there are ways that you can help or ways you're interested just to learn more about this legislation. As I mentioned at the beginning, you know, prior authorization and supporting efforts to make prior authorization go easier, faster, better. We certainly support that. We just know that we have to solve for the precursor issue. Step therapy, prior authorization, you know, these are things that people with hypertension and diabetes can address. They worry about these things now because they're already deemed medically necessary. But we in the rare disease community have to first make sure that insurance thinks of us as medically necessary. Then we can fight about prior authorization. So they really go hand in hand, and supporting one, we hope, also means supporting the other from your perspective. Thanks so much. I don't know if I have any questions, Shannon, so I'll let you ask me if there is one.
Great. Well, thank you, Syra. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I think for time efficiencies, we'll go ahead and move on to our final speaker, Lindsay Greenleaf with ADV Health. And just a reminder, we are recording this and this will be posted on our website. So it will, if you would like to come back to any of these presentations, including Lindsay's, you'll be able to find it there. So Lindsay, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thanks, Shannon. Great. If you turn, there we go. So we're here to talk about one of my favorite topics, pharmacy benefit managers. Before we get into the legislative and regulatory reforms that we're going to talk about, I thought I'd level set for a second, talk about real quick what PBMs are, what their role is, and the issues that we're facing as patients. So for starters, PBMs negotiate drug costs on behalf of health plans and employers. As part of their negotiation leverage, they have control over the health plan's formulary. They control whether a drug is covered or not, whether it's on a favorable formulary tier, whether or not there's burdensome prior auth or step therapy requirements, all of those things, that's in the control of the PBM. The more consolidated the PBM, the greater their negotiating power is. And as you can tell on the left side of this slide, this is a very consolidated industry. The top 3 PBMs hold 80% of the market. That means 80% of patients are enrolled in a health plan that is controlled by one of these 3 PBMs. You've got CVS Health with 33% of covered lives, Express Scripts with 26%, and then OptumRx with 21%. So this level of monopoly power has some downstream consequences for rare disease patients. Moving to the right side of the slide, what are those consequences? Well, for starters, out-of-pocket costs. PBMs, this is where things get a little complicated, and the supply chain on the pharmacy benefit is very complicated, so I'll start with that. But there are rebates that manufacturers pay to PBMs in exchange for getting coverage, in exchange for getting their drug onto the formulary. Because the PBMs have so much leverage, this monopoly power that they have, they're able to demand higher and higher rebates year over year from the manufacturers. That has the effect of manufacturers having an incentive to increase their list price, the list price of the drug, to make room to rebate back to the PBM. All that to say, inflated list prices are bad for patients because coinsurance is tied to that inflated list price. That's a big problem. Another out-of-pocket issue is copay accumulators. This is a dynamic that's relatively new, let's call it like in the last several years. This is where, to help with out-of-pocket issues, drug manufacturers will often provide coupons for patients in the commercial market. You show up at the pharmacy counter, say you have a coupon. This can usually be achieved online or through the pharmacist's own computer. And with that coupon, the patient pays no more than $25 or $50, something like that, for the drug. The manufacturer is picking up the tab from an out-of-pocket perspective. PBMs don't like copay coupons because when there's high coinsurance on a drug, they want there to be high coinsurance on the drug. That's one of the ways that they can control utilization. So PBMs have responded in recent years with what we call copay accumulator programs. That's where they do not allow those coupon funds to count towards the patient's deductible and out-of-pocket maximum. The PBM takes those funds for themselves, basically. This has the effect where patients have historically been able to hit their deductible or out-of-pocket maximum at a certain time through the benefit year by using coupons. Now, a lot of patients are surprised when the coupon amounts run out. They're then faced with this really daunting deductible. It can happen in the middle of the year, and they're nowhere near their out-of-pocket maximum that they thought they were. So moving to coverage, formulary exclusions. As part of this negotiation with drug manufacturers to get higher rebates, I mentioned that they're able to threaten to exclude drugs from the formulary. Over recent years, PBMs have used this power and excluded more and more drugs. Back in 2016, the top 3 PBMs, they each excluded about 100 drugs in 2016. Now, in 2023, there are 600 drugs. That's each PBM is excluding over 600 drugs on their formulary. The other piece on coverage, specialty drug carve-outs. This is a very new phenomenon. This is also referred to as alternative funding programs. This is a new thing that PBMs are doing where they will drop coverage entirely of a drug and steer that patient to the manufacturer's patient assistance program and tell the patient, we're not going to cover your drug anymore, but don't worry, this drug company has a very generous free drug program. Just go ask them for the drug for free. Well, you can imagine from a manufacturer perspective, they hate that. They'd much rather have an insurance company or PBM cover their drug and pay for it than give drug for free. That's obvious. From a patient perspective, this is a lot of confusion and a lot of treatment delays. So this is a big one. You just add this up on all the things that all the other speakers were talking about, the prior auth burdens that you're already facing, the confusion of dealing with your health plan in general. This is a real burden, and this is something that is specifically hitting the rare disease community really hard. We work with several rare disease manufacturers, and they were the first ones that told us about this. We have since the rare disease manufacturers told us about it, we have since heard of oncology manufacturers complaining about this as well. So this is something where they're going after the expensive therapies, and it's disproportionately hitting the rare disease patient community. And this last piece here, utilization management, as our panelists talked about before, prior authorization, step therapy, PBMs as part of their negotiations, over their formularies, they're able to impose prior authorization and step therapy when they feel like it. And they have such negotiation power. I just want to emphasize that left part of the slide. We're talking about some real monopoly power here with the big 3 PBMs representing 80% of commercial lives. So that's a background on the problems that we're facing as patients. If you go to the next slide, talk about what's going on to fix this. So with all that bad news, I do have good news, which is there is a flurry of activity on PBMs. I subscribe to, every healthcare type, email blast, Politico, whatever. And any email blast that you get that is healthcare related, one of the headlines in there is going to be, there's a new bill on PBMs that's been introduced. There's a new regulation that's being talked about. Something's happening. The spotlight is really on PBMs right now. And this is something that we've all been hoping would happen. This is not to say that these reforms that I'm about to tell you about, this is not to say that these changes are going to happen overnight by any means, but I think we are in a much better place than we've ever been in before. Some of the complications of getting to this point is the fact that this is such a complicated supply chain in the pharmacy benefit. It takes a long time to get policymakers' attention and to really understand the ins and outs of this to do anything. So we're at a good place. So where are we at? Regarding PBM's monopoly power, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, has a Section 6B study underway. They kicked that off in June of last year. That should complete in 2024. The takeaway there is they're going to be getting a lot of information from the PBMs that they've never had before on their business practices, what they're doing. It's just kind of fueling efforts at the FTC level to maybe do something to chip away at that monopoly power. We'll see. There's questions on the FTC's extent of their authority, but a promising development nonetheless. Out-of-pocket costs, big win in Medicare Part D. We have a new out-of-pocket cap that starts in 2024. Out-of-pocket costs will be capped at $3,333. In 2025 onward, there's going to be a $2,000 out-of-pocket cap. Still a lot of money for most folks, but much better than anything Part D patients were facing before. Then we've got a lot of bills that have been introduced targeting the role of rebates and all those other PBM issues I mentioned on the previous slide. We'll talk more about that in a second. And then I mentioned copay accumulators. We have 17 states that have passed copay accumulator bans. Very helpful. State regulated plans represent about 19, 20% of commercial lives. So that's very helpful for those folks in a state regulated plan in those states that have passed a law like that. We hope for more to be done on the federal level, fingers crossed there. From a coverage perspective, those specialty drug carve-outs I talked about, where they're forcing patients to try to get free drug from the manufacturer. AbbVie has sued. They sued about 6 weeks ago, about a month ago. Lawsuits take a while to play out, but we'll see. Best of luck to them. We'll be watching that. And on the utilization management front, would note there's a million reports out there. Our friends at the AMA that talked earlier on this webinar, they put out some great reports talking about the physician provider burden with prior auth. Every time you turn around, there's even new government reports. OIG's taking a closer look at this. So we've got some momentum of policymakers really paying attention to prior auth and step therapy. 37 state laws have been enacted related to step therapy, very helpful. And then on the federal level, we have the Safe Step Act, which would require a more generous, more clear appeals process for step therapy. If step therapy is imposed, that bill has now been included in a bigger PBM bill called the Pharmacy Benefit Manager Reform Act. That bill is making its way through Congress. We have high hopes for that. Stay tuned there. And that's my quick rundown. The next two slides, Shannon, if you just show the next one to give an idea, you guys, we can send these around later, but we have some, this table here, and then the next slide has a table too, but this is a snapshot of all the federal bills that are moving on PBMs. I think the biggest takeaway is just the volume. There's this, and then the next slide. These bills, you can see some of them overlap in the topics they're addressing. I would just note from a big picture, transparency efforts have the greatest likelihood of going to the president's desk for enactment. Doing things around transparency takes the least amount of political courage in a divided Congress. You know, you can think Congress could at least accomplish that. So we do expect something at least on a transparency level to happen. But maybe one of these bigger bills could move too. We're still watching. Still a little early to see, but we've had some great movement at the committee level, and a lot of these bills have been, marked up, and we're waiting, to get on the House and Senate floor. So that's it for me. Any questions?
I'm looking at the chat now, Lindsay.
Yes.
A couple of questions related to which states have passed copay accumulator legislation and step therapy bills. How would folks find out which states those happened in?
Yes, and I see someone already posted a great link that All Copays Count Coalition is really helpful. They might have a stat for you there. I can follow up, and Shannon will think how best to let the group know somehow. I can get you guys a citation on that though.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat or Q&A for today. So thank you so much for being here, Lindsay. If folks have any questions, they of course can reach out to myself or Caitlin, and we can make sure to direct anyone's questions to the appropriate person or contact that we have. Thank you to all of our speakers for being here today. I know we went a little bit over, but it was really good, important information. So I'm glad we were able to get it all in for today. Our next webinar will be in September. So we get August a little break in August due to the slowdown with Congress being in recess. So our next webinar will be September 21st at noon Eastern. And here is our contact information in case anyone would like to get in touch with Caitlin or myself or follow RDLA if you don't already. And thank you to our supporters and sponsors for their support of today's webinar. Thank you, everyone. I hope everyone is having a safe and happy summer and staying cool and healthy. Thank you all and look forward to seeing you all soon.